talk. By the way, you may have noticed when you walked in today, there are some envelopes on your table, just to build a little bit of excitement. Later, those will come into play, but please don't open them yet. So we'll get to those after Joe's talk. So, and I want to thank you all for coming today. It's a real pleasure to speak to you. Today I'll be talking about specifically the senses of smell and taste and how these connect to experience, and particularly the experience of the guest, whether it's in a museum, a theme park, or an interpretive center, and so forth. So Gordon was talking about the experiences of guests being underwhelmed, maybe in some sensory senses. So I wanted to mention the work of Marcel Proust, who, of course, is a famous writer. You know his work, Remembrance of Things Past, and draw attention to this quote in particular. When nothing else subsists from the past, after the things are broken and scattered, the smell and taste of things remain poised a long time, like souls, bearing resiliently on tiny and almost impalpable drops of their essence, the immense edifice of memory. If you know Proust's work, he, of course, instituted our understandings of how sensory appeals or sensory stimuli in an environment can trigger memory. And there's a really great story that he retells in his great 7-volume work, where he's eating a very simple thing, a little cookie or a piece of cake, basically, dipping that into a cup of tea, and he describes the situation as one of shuddering. This memory, this moment of memory comes back to him somehow from the past, and it's all because of this sensorial aspect of dipping the cookie in the tea, the smell, and the taste of it all. And so if we think about Proust and his work on memory, we might actually recall that memory, the etymology, the meaning of memory, involves not just the idea of recollection, which is, I think, the meaning we often think of, but it also involves anxiety and sadness. And so I think he indicates that with memory and with the senses, it's not necessarily that positive things are going to be recalled when you have a sensory experience in a space. And indeed, if you're designing for an interpretive center, if you're doing work, say, on genocide or dark history, or what we call dark theming, you may want to use sensory stimuli in an environment to recall less positive memories. But all the while, they are hopefully putting the guest in the space. I'll talk about this in a second, but one of the things that happens is, of course, the use of the senses and the memories that they may recall are subjective. And cultural anthropologists talk about the idea of an emic perspective. And an emic perspective is what we call the insider's perspective. So how each and every one of you today is experiencing this talk, how each and every one of you will experience going into the trade hall, seeing the latest VR rides, having those little mini donuts, which if you haven't had the mini donuts, and maybe have your own Proustian moment of memory. But anthropologists try to remind us that it's so important to try to get inside the head of the individual, of the guest, subjectively within a space. So moving to smell, to the olfactory sense and ambiance, I will point to this quote by Lush here. And how many of you right now can recall a smell memory of Lush Cosmetics? Have you ever walked by? Quite a few people. I think it's very distinctive, and this quote is then reminiscent of maybe that experience. The next time you smell something that immediately brings you back to a certain time in your life, linger there for a moment. Who needs a time machine when your nose can be the key to a transcendent, nostalgic moment? Smelling is believing. And so Lush, I think, very effectively has connected smell. Perhaps down the road, if you visit another Lush shop, you have that memory moment, and thus it's really getting us into experience and perception of the guest who walks into that store. Indeed, there's been a lot of research done. There are entire groups of schools of anthropological thought that focuses on sensory studies. There's also ample literature on the subject, everything from the book Love Marks to Brand Sense, focuses on some of the amazing brand and spatial connections that we can make with using the senses. And Martin Lindstrom says here that research has shown a 40% improvement in our mood when we're exposed to a pleasant fragrance, particularly if the fragrance taps into a joyful memory. And I've highlighted joyful and pleasant here because this really gets us into the the thick, I think, of sensory experiences and the fact that sensory experiences often are subjective. And so therefore that's the challenge of approaching the use of the senses, connecting those to memory, connecting those to experience, say within the realm of a museum or a theme park. So it's no easy matter. I think that's something we'll maybe walk away with today. Connecting that sense of smell more to the brand, we can look at a series of studies, and one in particular said that only the sense of smell can connect to the three important aspects of retailing: arousal, pleasure, and overall satisfaction. Now, I'm not advocating that smell is any better than any of the other senses, and we'll, I think, talk about today, and we'll do a little activity later that focuses on how we can combine the senses in some powerful ways that they work together in a holistic sense. Clearly, though, we should say that smell is a key sense in terms of recalling things like memory, as Bruce talked about, creating ambiance and atmosphere in themed and immersive spaces, establishing the identity of the brand in the space, and also connecting the guests to experiences, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant experiences. Now, in the case of another smell here, how many of you right now can have a memory, a smell memory of Abercrombie and Fitch store? Many more people, and there's others. I hear little gasps and sounds, and maybe we won't get into what that means, but maybe you have a strong connection to that scent, fierce. You can see here there are some folks protesting the scent. I can't understand why they would, but maybe some of you can. So, this particular blog that this story comes from is telling the story, the goodbye to the smell of fierce in the Emf Stores, and this person is sort of sad about this happening. There's tradition here, it's part of the brand identity, and anytime someone changes their brand identity, if you remember the Gap fiasco years ago, the logo switch, which I think graphic designers were horrified when that Gap logo switch happened and they switched back. But in the case of this connection between the brand and the scent fierce, which is pumped through the stores, I think people have a lot of opinions and understandings. And I think this may explain maybe why they switched to Elwood and two other scents. So this is a study done by Fordham University in 2014, and they're specifically trying to connect our senses of smell and our perceptions of space. And there's two types of spaces we could talk about: a crowded space, and the theory is that in a crowded space, maybe like in one of the crowded and dark A&F stores, people want to perceive something that's a more open scent in an empty space. So a space that is devoid of people, a space maybe that is outdoors or has a feel of an agora, an open space. People prefer more of a closed scent. So what I've done is just charted that here: open space and closed space. And again, we might associate open space with feelings or notions of expansiveness and freedom in the outdoors. A closed space might be more enclosed, confined, and indoors. And then on the left there, we have then the sense that, according to the study, would be perceived as better or more likable or pleasurable for the guest in that space. So in the case, again, of an open space, we should avoid the open scent. An open scent might be something connoting the outdoors, trees, apples, coconut, and so forth. So for that space, we should actually go for, according to the study, a closed scent. For example, firewood, popcorn, or musk. It reminds me a little bit of if you've been to Dennis Seaver's house in London. Gordon's been there. It's a very evocative multi-sensory space, and one of the things they do very effectively there is they light fires and have smells in the kitchen, and it's part of the overall immersive sensation, and you have to walk through that particular space in silence. So it's an incredible multi-sensory space that I recommend you all visit. Now, the next, this column here gets to, I think, the situation in the A&F stores. So if it's a closed space, and most people would say a store like Abercrombie & Fitch is dark, maybe it's a bit foreboding as you walk in. And by the way, retail spaces, I don't think there's been enough research done on how retail spaces themselves are evocative immersive spaces. I recently did a research study of some of the amazing boutiques in Portland, Oregon, and I was particularly amazed to see just how they develop the spaces in terms of material culture, brands, and so forth. We often think of those spaces only through the products, but we should think of them as, I think, fully immersive spaces. So in the case of the Emf Store, the movement away from fierce suggests that perhaps, because it is a closed space, they're moving more towards an open scent. And in that new scent, the Elwood, it has musk, which, according to the chart here, is a closed scent. We balance it with citrus, right? Citrus connotes the outdoors, and citrus is so important to Florida. Go to Disney Springs, you see a lot of citrus there used as part of the backstory a little bit. So this suggests maybe the reason for changing was to try to get away from some of the perceptions that people had with that particular scent at their stores. Just very briefly on taste today, the idea of touch points. A lot of people would say that taste is a very underused sense in experiential spaces, also in branding. Some studies out there have said that less than 20% of the popular brands out there actually leverage the sense of taste. And we might ask why this is the case. And in your future, if you, I don't know, get involved in any kind of activities, maybe even the seminar today, you might think about how taste could be used in a hypothetical themed or immersive space. We could think about the five senses, and by the way, other cultures out there perceive more than five senses. We're using five for the sense of discussion today. But you can think about the distance of perception, so if there's a sound in the back of the room, maybe I can hear that before I can see something. When you get into the sense of taste, it's the closest to us. Typically, I have to taste something in my mouth, right, to have a sensibility about it. And that's, I think, one of the challenges of using taste. How many of you have been to Alinea restaurant in Chicago? No one's been there. You have to go there. Please, if you go to Chicago, go to Alinea. It's worth the $400 price. I kid you not. Go to the best restaurant in the world years ago. Grant Achatz, who's an inspirational chef, if you know his story about dealing with tongue cancer and everything. But what he does so effectively there is creates a multi-sensorial experience for the guest. Literally every sense is used, and not just taste. Taste is the obvious one. And even when he uses taste, he plays tricks on your mind, which is the point of molecular gastronomy. So when I was eating there, I was eating a grape, and lo and behold, I was actually eating salmon. It was a grape that tasted like salmon. And so there's all kinds of tricks that he plays, almost in the sense that a performance artist or a conceptual artist will try to play with their senses in a museal space or an installation or something like that. The sense of touch is utilized because all the silverware, all the accoutrements for the amazing food, you actually touch that. The seats themselves are custom designed for the restaurant. Walking into the space, you have this amazing experience where literally you're walking down a dark hall, and the door opens automatically, and you're thrown into the restaurant. And so what Achatz is doing at Alinea is doing something very performative and conceptual. And I really want to suggest that if you're using the senses, I think we can avoid that easy moment, the scratch and sniff, say for smell, or you go into a museum and maybe there's something that says, turn this dial and you smell cinnamon. That's okay. That's certainly okay. That's the first step. But if we approach what someone like Achatz is doing in this very performative and conceptual sense, that's when we can affect the guest at levels of memory, at levels that are almost, I would say, existential in nature. So I really would leave you with that. And I want to mention our article and leave you with this quote here. If you haven't picked up a copy, in addition to eating the mini donuts today in the trade hall, please pick up a copy of Attractions Management by IAAPA Central. And the three of us wrote this article talking about the senses, so more of the ideas can be explored there. And I will leave you with this quote today as an opportunity to collaborate and to combine the senses. We should note that the senses should never be considered in isolation from one another. As we think about effective sensory design, we should remember to leverage the power of one sense to impact another, with the overall effect being the greater immersion of the guest in the space in question. I thank you very much for your time, and I'll pass it on to